So today's reading for the sermon is going to be from Matthew 7, verses 1 to 5. Matthew 7, verses 1 to 5. Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, whilst the log is in your eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Well, for those that haven't been with us over the last few weeks, we've been gradually working through the Sermon on the Mount. And we're probably about halfway through now. It's amazing how much material there is in the sermon, and we're really only scraping the surface. This morning, the passage that we look at, like the passage that we looked at last week, in some ways it might seem quite straightforward, but in other ways it seems to be entirely contradictory to what it also says elsewhere in the Bible. Particularly, it's talking about the judgments that we make in our life. We all make judgments in our day-to-day life. Myself, I grew up in a fairly large city, and being a young boy grown up in a city, I had to learn how to keep myself safe when walking around the city. So because of that, I learned how to make judgments where I may be walking down the street, there may be a large gang of children who are older than me hanging outside a shop or something like that. I, in the sort of place that I lived, had to make the judgment, it's probably best that I don't walk through that gang. I'm going to go to the other side of the road and go down on the other side of the pavement. Sometimes I learnt that through trial and error, but particularly as I got older, I learnt how to judge the situations. However, this passage, when you read the first verse, which says, do not judge that you may not be judged, it seems very clear. It seems to be implying that we shouldn't be judging people. But is it really that straightforward? Is that really what this passage is saying? Is Jesus calling us as Christians not to be judging people, not to be making a judgment on how we can help people? I think that we can begin to understand this by looking across the Bible, looking at the relationships that the Bible characters have had with God, and learn something of how they've actually related to one another. And today, I would like us to be looking at three characters. The first two that I'm going to introduce, I'm going to call the fool and the self-righteous. And they found themselves in a situation. They found themselves in a situation where they were at a bit of an impasse. They were in that typical argumentative situation where they both felt that they were right. They did not see the perspective of the other person. One of them, the fool, he was a very rich man, and he was known for his meanness and his stinginess. Surprisingly, he had a beautiful and clever wife, and it really was one of these situations where nobody could quite understand how a guy that was so mean and so stingy, a person that felt so self-privileged, could have a wife who was so beautiful and so wise and so clever. There really was a big contrast between this foolish man and his wife. The fool lived in a large manor house outside of a city because he owned a sizable farm, the sort of farm which had fields and fields of produce as well as livestock that he was responsible for. Now, the self-righteous man, he had helped the fool's farm hands one time because there was a risk that there might be people who were going to be coming in and trying to steal some of the produce at the farm. There was a risk that there were predators which would come in and maybe kill some of the animals on the farm. And the self-righteous man had gone out of his way to help the farmer's farm, keeping it safe, keeping the foolish man's possession safe, also keeping his farmhands safe. The self-righteous man had given the fool a favor, and he believed that the fool owed him something for it. The fool and the self-righteous man, they came head to head when the self-righteous man called in a favor. He asked the fool if he could provide him with some of his harvest. He thought surely the fool has enough harvest that he would be able to share some of it with him. Well, the fool, he considered the man's request, and after judging him, he condemned him as he replied, "Who do you think you are? I do not know you. You are beneath me. Why would I give you some of my provisions when I have a family to feed and my employees to pay? You may have done me a favor, but that doesn't mean that I now owe you something." Well, the self-righteous man listened, and you could tell as he was listening to him, his face was turning red with anger. He was thinking in his head, "Who am I? Who do you think you are thinking, who am I? I will show you exactly who I am." So he gathered friends together. You might call them a gang, or maybe a small army is a better way to describe it. He gathered together 400 men, and he gathered them together with one purpose: to take revenge on the fool. He judged the fool and he condemned him. The irony is that the two men, the fool and the self-righteous, they are both hypocrites. They failed to notice the log in their own eyes and became caught up in the speck that they can see in each other's. And like in many situations that we find ourselves in, they back themselves into a corner. The fool, he didn't want to seem weak, and yet the self-righteous, he wanted to seem strong. And although they were coming from two completely different perspectives, they had reached the same conclusion that they were both in the right. I wonder how many times we have been in a position where we feel that we were well within our right to make a judgment on somebody. I know I have plenty of times. Actually, just yesterday, I went to the Tesco in Stirling in order to do a click and collect. And the idea of click and collect is you order it on the internet from the comfort of your home. You then turn up and it takes you maybe 5 minutes maximum. You pick up your shopping and then you go home. However, after 40 minutes of waiting for my shopping, I was getting to the point where I was thinking, well, maybe I would have been quicker if I just gone in and picked up all of my shopping myself. I was certainly in a situation where I felt that I had a right to be able to have a grumble. I had a right when I went up there and spoke to the person to complain at the lack of service. I didn't, in case you're wondering. Like a good English person, I just quietly said, it's all okay, it's lovely, it was no inconvenience. I wasn't having to pick up my children or anything like that. However, we've all found ourselves in that situation, haven't we, where we feel that we're in some sort of privileged position. So if we think about that and we think about the situation that the self-righteous and the fool got themselves into, a situation which at the moment has escalated to the point where the self-righteous person is literally going around to the fool's house with 400 men in order to take his revenge. Maybe Jesus was meaning it literally when he said it's better not to judge. Maybe he was. Maybe judging each other only brings harm, and ultimately highlights that we are hypocrites. After all, it says clearly in the Bible that we will all be judged. None of us are perfect. It says in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 17, in due season God will judge everyone, both good and bad, for all their deeds. In Romans 2 verse 1, it says, you may think you can condemn such people, but you are just as bad, as you have no excuse. When you say they are wicked and should be punished, you are condemning yourself, for you who judge others do these very same things. Is that what Jesus was saying? Certainly, when he talks about us not noticing the log in our own eye, when we're judging the speck in somebody else's, there's truth in that. None of us are perfect. And it's very easy to be hypocritical when we do decide to make a judgment on someone. However, I would suggest that this passage isn't quite saying this. It isn't quite saying that as Christians, we should not judge other people. So how else could we look at it? Well, I think there is another way. And I said earlier that there are three characters in the story. There was actually the self-righteous, the fool, and the wise wife. The wise wife that everybody was surprised that the fool was able to have, for want of a better word, it's not that he owns her. Well, before the fool and the self-righteous men could do themselves any harm, before they met each other and started battling with each other, one of the employees of the fool very wisely ran to the fool's wife. Because, as I said earlier, she was well known for being wise. And the employee thought, surely she would know what to do. When the employee came and told the wife what was happening, he was definitely on the side of the self-righteous person. He agreed that the self-righteous person had done them a huge favor, that when they'd been out working the fields, that they had been kept safe by the self-righteous person. He said, and everyone knows that the fool is mean. He can't be reasoned with. And now, the self-righteous person is going to take revenge. The fool is getting his comeuppance. However, the employee was concerned that with 400 men, the self-righteous person wasn't just going to be taking revenge on the fool, he was going to be taking it on his whole household. Well, as the wife heard this, she considered the situation. She gathered together the best provisions that she could find, far more than what the self-righteous man had asked for. She loaded them in her car. She told the employee to direct her to the self-righteous man. And when she saw the self-righteous man, she got out of her car. She came in front of him. She dropped onto the ground with tears streaming down her eyes. She came to him and said, let me take the blame. I should have been there when your men came asking for provisions. It was my fault. I would have given them everything that you needed and more. Don't blame the fool. It is in his nature to judge too quickly and always think the worst of people. Please forgive our family. Please refrain from taking vengeance and risk spilling blood. In her wisdom, the wife, she judged the situation. She knew that her husband was beyond reason, but she did not want something tragic to befall her family because she loved them all. Her judgment in that situation, rather than bringing condemnation, it served both the foolish and the self-righteous men. Her wise words stopped the event from escalating. She approached the situation objectively with love. She made up for the lack of generosity of the fool. She took the blame onto herself. This was even when she had nothing to do with the situation, She went and met a small army of 400 men and put herself in danger. In her wisdom, rather than accusing people, she very skillfully outlined the severity of the situation. She highlighted that the outcome wouldn't be good for anybody. In the end, her actions resolved what was a very serious situation. Now, how many of you have picked up what story it was that I was very roughly telling? I'm pretty sure Anne did, because she started grinning partway through. But for this story, this can actually be found in the Old Testament. It's in 1 Samuel 25, verses 2 to 35, and it is the story of King David, Nabal, and his wife, Abigail. In the story, King David was the self-righteous man. He did, after asking for provisions off of Nabal, decide that he was going to draw together an army of 300 to 400 people to go and kill every male in the household. Nabal's name literally means fool. And he was so privileged that he didn't want to seem weak. He thought the worst of people, and he was quick to judge. And because of that, these attributes allowed the situation to escalate so much further than what they should have. However, Abigail was the wise wife, and she showed through her actions that despite the inadequacies or the failings of her husband, she still loved him. She put herself in danger in order to resolve the situation that put everybody else at risk. She judged the situation, but she judged out of love. She judged in a way that she was serving the people that she was judging. And in response to Abigail's words to David, David replied and said, "Praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me today. Thank God for your good sense. Bless you for keeping me from murder and from carrying out vengeance with my own hands. For I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, who has kept me from hurting you, that if you had not hurried out to meet me, not one of Nabal's men would still be alive tomorrow morning." Then David accepted her present and told her, "Return home in peace. I have heard what you said. We will not kill your husband." David's reply emphasized the gravity of how much Abigail had helped the situation. She diffused the situation from escalating to a point that David now realized he certainly would have come to have regretted. There is no doubt that Abigail had corrected David, but she did it in a loving and serving way rather than a condemning way. She came alongside David and tried to help him see the error of his ways. Abigail was quite unique, really, as she was able to approach the situation with wisdom and love. And that is something that we all know is hard to do when we're invested in an argument. And this is why it's important that we come alongside each other and help each other realize a different perspective in a situation, and that we always do that in a loving way. We are called into community as Christians, and a community that is distinct. A community that when people look onto the community, they don't just feel this is just another social group, but this is a community that is different. A community that responds to one another in love, particularly when it's dealing with conflict. Conflict, which is always inevitable in community, inevitable when different people come together. Abigail demonstrated this. However, we have a much better example even than Abigail today. You could say that we are without excuse in how we deal with one another. And the example is, of course, Jesus. And Jesus' life, in every way, is an example of how we can judge with love rather than condemnation. Jesus was a person who sat at a table and ate with people of various reputations, whilst all the other religious leaders looked on and shook their head in dismay, thinking, why would he be eating with these filthy people, these despicable people, these liars? Jesus, and yet felt that they were worthy of him to sit with them. He put himself between relationships that were fractured, relationships that were broken. And rather than weigh in the wrongs and side in with the person that was right, instead, he offered forgiveness. He offered forgiveness to the billions of people who were in the wrong. And Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us not to judge so that we may not be judged. He warns us not to be hypocritical in our judgments. We find ourselves, if we do that we'll only end up in the same position as either the fool or the self-righteous person, either the person that's too quick to judge or the person who feels that they are in a privileged position. But however, he also said at the end of the passage, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. And in what he said, there's a clue. There's a clue to the third way that Abigail had demonstrated, but was ultimately exemplified in Christ. It is a way that does not judge to condemn, but to serve one another with love. It is a way that starts with Jesus, who helps us to identify what are the logs that we have in our own eyes. And it ends with Jesus, who's able to take away the guilt that we're carrying. Jesus not only teaches us this in his word, but he also demonstrated it in his life. And so now, as we come to prepare ourselves for communion, we're just going to be having a slight change to the order. We're going to be listening to the song Servant King, because the lyrics are so appropriate for what we've been looking at this morning. And so I just suggest that we just stay seated whilst we're getting ready. Feel free to sing along, but reflect on the words as they close our message this morning.
From heaven you came, helpless babe, entered our world, your glory veiled, not to be served, but to serve, and give your life that we might live. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our life as a daily offering of worship to the servant King.
There in the Garden of Tea, my heavy load He chose to bear. His heart with sorrow was torn, yet not my will, but yours, He said.
This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our life as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. Come see His hands and His feet, the scars